Good evening, and welcome back to the Poe Museum. For this episode of the Curator's Crypt, one of our Patreon supporters has suggested that we talk about some of the illustrations to Poe's works in our collection. But there have been thousands of illustrations by some of the world's leading artists done over the years. So I decided to narrow it down to just one of Poe's most popular works, one that's been illustrated by some of the greatest artists of all time. But which work should be the focus of tonight's episode? It would have to be the kind of work that people would recognize immediately. I pondered the question over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore until it hit me. So we'll be discussing some of the greatest illustrations to Poe's classic poem, The Raven, on tonight's installment of the Curator's Crypt. The Raven has been illustrated by hundreds of artists over the years, ever since Poe first published the poem back in 1845. So where do we begin? Well, let's start at the beginning. Just 9 years after Poe's death, in 1858. So here, the poetical works of Edgar Allan Poe from 1858. And the first poem in the book is The Raven, as illustrated by Sir John Tenniel. Never heard of him? Well, less than a decade later, he'd be the one to illustrate Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. And I want you to notice the first illustration here. This is how a lot of the illustrated editions start out. There's a guy sitting at a desk. He has an open book in front of him, an ottoman next to him with an open book on it. And in the background, you can just see the pallid bust of Pallas just above his chamber door. All the elements to set you on the course of this narrative. And of course, the raven flies in the room looking a little bit like a dove, but close enough. A lot of people have trouble getting the raven right. They substitute in other species. I guess a lot of the artists haven't actually seen a raven. And here's the concluding illustration. That raven never flitting, still is sitting, just above the bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door. So these are pretty standard illustrations for the raven. But there's one I'd like to show you from the 1880s by the French artist Odilon Redon. Now, he shows you a different kind of raven you probably never would have expected. It looks sort of like a kiwi to me. But Redon was a very important French symbolist painter. He painted dreamlike images of the bizarre, the macabre, the morbid. So Poe was right up his alley. He actually did a whole series of lithographs in 1882 dedicated to Edgar Allan Poe. But Redon wasn't the only major French artist to illustrate the Raven. No, there was also this one, right here, Edward Manet. Now, the name Edward Manet may or may not be familiar to you. This is not Claude Monet, the water lily guy. This is Edouard Manet, the Olympia guy. So just remember that. And in 1875, he was talking with his friend Stéphane Mallarmé, who is a great French symbolist poet, who'd done translations of Poe's works into French, and they had the idea of coming up with a series of deluxe editions of Poe's works translated by Mallarmé, illustrated by Manet. But they were only able to get one of those books done. It was The Raven. So check out some of these illustrations here. This is the scene where the raven is flying in the window, And from a distance, it's almost abstract. Just look at the loose brushwork here. Instead of being trapped in a little box on the page, this thing just spreads all over the page. But I think this is probably his most innovative illustration. Here you can barely even tell what it is. Just with a few strokes of the brush, he's made the chair, the shadow, and of course the shadow of the bust of Pallas with the raven on it. But if Manet is not to your taste, we have a set of illustrations here from the illustrator of all illustrators, the greatest illustrator in the world, Gustave Doré, the great Frenchman here. This was the only time that Doré ever condescended to illustrate the work of an American author. The cover of the edition here is by American artist Dora Wheeler. And once you get inside, check out the inscription there, dated 1883. A Merry Christmas to this darling wife. So this was a Christmas present back in the day. How about that idea of giving your wife a Christmas present of a poem about a dead wife? And here's the frontispiece by Elihu Vedder, another American artist. Really little known, but very innovative, important symbolist painter, with Poe there and Doré here. But let's get to the meat of the thing. This is the actual illustrations inside. So here it kicks off with once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary o'er many quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore. Once again, the man sitting next to a table, same lamp as we see in the other illustrations, an open book here right next to his foot. And this is probably the most mundane of all illustrations because they get better from here on out. Ah, distinctly I remember it was in the bleak December, in each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. And you can just barely see in the background here these shadowy, ghostly figures emerging. Here, eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I sought to borrow from my book surcease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore. So Doré's magnificent, detailed, imaginative, almost overwhelming illustrations are still the quintessential Raven illustrations to date and are still in print. But not everybody was a fan. Back here in the States, there was a young vaudeville performer, the lightning caricaturist named James William Carling. And he said, you know, Doré's illustrations are pretty, but mine will be stormier, wilder, and more weird than anything ever done before. And Carling set out to make the strangest, weirdest set of illustrations that had ever been done. He thought that he alone was spiritually bonded with Poe and could interpret the Raven like nobody else ever could because he really understood Poe's intentions. He did 43 illustrations. Unfortunately, they were too stormy, too wild, and too weird to be published. So they weren't actually published during the author's lifetime. In fact, they weren't all published in a complete edition till now. And you can buy a copy of that in the Poe Museum's online store at poemuseum.org/museum-store. Well, I'd like to conclude tonight's far from comprehensive survey of Raven illustrations with this one, drawn not in a book, but carved by artist Zane Wiley onto the top of a human skull, which also bears the complete text of Poe's poem. Well, thanks for joining us this week. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that my good friend Edgar the Poe Museum cat took issue with us devoting an entire episode to a bird. So he took it upon himself to eliminate the competition. He hopes that maybe next week we'll learn that Poe's favorite animal friend is the cat. And before we leave, I'd like to remind you that you could have already seen this episode simply by supporting the Poe Museum at patreon.com/Poe Museum. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time in the Curator's Crypt.